Hello. In this video, I want to demonstrate a real basic understanding of the difference between observables and promises in Angular. Now, observables ship by default with Angular, and they are part of the RxJS package, which stands for Reactive JavaScript. And observables are a relatively new pattern, but they're similar to promises in the sense that what they're designed to do is deal with asynchronous code. And so the most common use case for them is going to be when you're dealing with the HTTP client, or basically trying to access data from an API. Now, the HTTP client returns an observable by default, but it is possible to use a promise with it instead by using this particular plugin here, this toPromise. So I'm going to show you how to use both of them. So we're going to make a sample observable real quick. Where we're going to, basically all we need to do is return this.http.get and what we're trying to get. And to do a promise instead, we would be doing the same thing, except for afterwards we would call the toPromise command. Now, these look relatively similar except for this particular thing here, and that's not really where the difference is. Now, to use the observable, we would call that function and then call the subscribe command. And you can pass it a result. And you can also make another callback for errors. And then you can do what you would normally do to respond to that within this. And using a promise really looks pretty relatively identical, except for you're using then instead of the subscribe function. And you can do the same thing where you're passing an error function afterwards, and really all of this code looks the same, except for the difference between using the then function and using the subscribe function. But that is really where the primary difference between observables and promise exists. Because when you're using a promise, when you call this function, it actually initiates the HTTP call and sends the promise down as a single value. Whereas when you are using an observable, calling this subscribe method afterwards is actually what instantiates the HTTP request. So, like, for instance, we could basically create a scaffold for your API call with that, and then you could call the API multiple times by basically calling subscribe multiple times off of the same variable. So that's really one of the primary differences between observables and promises, is that the observable builds out essentially a scaffold for the connection, whereas the promise actually instantiates the connection and sends the value down. And a lot of the control that you can get from an observable comes from that, where instances such as it being able to be cancelable, observables are cancelable, or promises are not. Observables can emit more than one object where promises cannot. But a lot of these more advanced use cases are really well suited for other types of data and things like that. But for simple HTTP calls where you're only using one value anyway, it's perfectly acceptable to continue using promises. And they are still part of the native ES6 setup. So definitely, if you feel like using promises, if you're more familiar with using them, you can continue to use them. Or if you want to start trying to leverage some of the more advanced features with observables, you can see that they work in a relatively similar fashion, at least on a base level. So that is really the basics of observables versus promises.